isolated us from our allies, increased the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran, and made us less safe. Finally, I hope the vote today is the first of a broader reassertion of Congress's war powers, including the sunset or repeal of the 2001 and 2002 authorizations of military force, which have been stretched beyond recognition. It is past time for Congress to do our job and not simply write the executive a blank check. I urge a yes vote on the resolution and yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Watkins.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I spent somewhere around 8.5 years in conflict environments, post-conflict environments between Iraq and Afghanistan, and in all that time I knew many people who suffered at the hand of Qasem Soleimani. One in particular takes me back to 2006 or 7. I was smoking and joking at the embassy in Baghdad. Shortly thereafter, I was doing so with a friend, really a brother, a West Point classmate, who shortly thereafter went out on a mission, ultimately was killed in a complex attack perpetrated by Qasem Soleimani. I understand that action leads to risk, but inaction leads to more risk in the long run. And when searching for this divine strategy, look to what tactical operators know to be true, and that is when we go throughout our work on the ground with an assault rifle in one hand, a sat phone in the other, we need to know that should anything happen to us, our president's going to have the freedom to rain fire down upon our enemies. So thank you so much, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to an esteemed member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of the resolution. Without a coherent strategy, such actions as the recent ones that occurred in Iraq present a dangerous move forward for the United States engaging in a war that the American people do not want. Today, we move to reclaim power that the executive branch has tried to usurp from Congress. We assert our constitutional authority to determine if the country are to go to war. And we send a message loud and clear, that we do not want to go to war. We will not engage in a reckless hostilities to endanger American lives, American interests, and our American values without fully evaluating imminent threat. And we must continue to assert that without new authorizations from Congress, this administration cannot engage in offensive military actions. That's what our framers intended. Madam Speaker, I yield back the remaining part of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, former CIA officer, Mr. Hurd.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, right now is not the time for a partisan exercise that could be used as propaganda by the Ayatollahs. Instead, Congress should be united in condemning a regime that has been attacking America and our allies for 40 years. Qasem Soleimani was the head of the most dangerous and well-armed terrorist organization in the world, and his death has removed a major terrorist leader off the battlefield. This decision followed repeated rocket attacks by Iranian proxies on American forces in an attempt to storm our embassy in Baghdad. This decision was based on intelligence that our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has described as compelling, imminent, and very clear that Soleimani was planning attacks against our troops. This is an assessment with which I concur. No one wants another war in the Middle East. Instead of tying the hands of our military, we should be sending a strong message to the Iranian regime that there will be consequences for their reign of terror, and we will protect our citizens at all costs. The Iranian regime has killed over 600 American troops in Iraq. They have killed over 1,500 of their own people for peacefully protesting. And they have lied to the world about their nuclear arsenal. Appeasing them will only make future conflict and bloodshed more likely. That's why I wish today, instead of this partisan exercise, that we were sending to the government of Iran a clearer message that no elected official in America is supportive of its behavior. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank the chair. Well, President Bush's invasion of Iraq was the worst foreign policy mistake in the history of the United States based on fake intelligence. And President Trump took us to the brink of war with Iran with an impulsive act the end of last week, which would be even more disastrous than the war with Iraq, which is still reverberating throughout the region. Now, some on that side say, oh, you're not with the troops, you're apologizing. No, we're not. We are reasserting the constitutional duty that you're sworn to in this House of Representatives. Congress and only Congress can declare war. Once we have declared war, the President of the United States, as Commander-in-Chief, can conduct it as much as this gentleman could. This is just a step. We need to repeal the authorization for the use of military force against Iraq based on fake intelligence, because that was his lawyer's rationalization why they could do this in Iraq, a sovereign nation, without their permission. And we also have to reform the War Powers Act, because the War Powers Act itself does not reflect our constitutional authority. And finally, we have to pass an amendment to prohibit a hostile action against Iran without authority from Congress.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nebraska, General Bacon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I oppose this resolution that is designed to embarrass our president in front of the world, and in reality gives comfort to Iran's leadership. It weakens America and emboldens our enemies. This resolution is not needed. The War Powers Act is still in effect, and the president is not conducting combat operations against Iran. He wants de-escalation. He does not want war. He's not doing what President Obama did in Libya. What the president did was a one-time defensive operation when he targeted General Soleimani. And let us be clear, Soleimani murdered 609 Americans in Iraq. His proxies attacked our embassy. The Quds Force he commanded shed blood across the world. He even attempted terrorism right here in Washington, D.C. He was the #1 threat to Israel, and he was anti-Semitism personified. I knew who Soleimani was when I was in Iraq. We were targeted by rockets every single day from Iranian proxies, trained in, funded by, and armed by Iran, and sometimes led by Iranian commanders, and fellow Americans died. The targeting of Soleimani is justice for the 609 families who had a son or daughter murdered by this guy, and the thousands missing an arm or a leg because of his savagery. In bringing up this resolution, the Speaker said our targeting of Soleimani was disproportionate. It's disgusting. This guy killed 609 Americans in Iraq alone. He was the mastermind. Does it take 100 more, 200 more, or 300 more? It's vile. Our strike was also defensive. General Milley said he saw some of the best intelligence he's ever seen, and that it clearly showed Soleimani was in Baghdad planning an imminent attack on Americans. To deny this is to call General Milley a liar. This resolution weakens America and gives hope to the Ayatollah that we don't have the resolve to stand up to these attacks. A house divided will not stand. I pray wise leadership prevails, that we unify to oppose Iranian terror that murdered hundreds of our fellow citizens. I yield.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a gentlewoman who has worked very hard on these issues for many years, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chairman for yielding and also for your tremendous leadership. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of H-Con Res 83. This critical resolution helps put a check on this administration's reckless and irrational, unauthorized military actions against Iran. The American people do not want, and we cannot allow, another unnecessary war of choice in the Middle East. This resolution is an important step in our efforts to prevent that from happening. This will restore our constitutional duty over military action. Also, we must take up my bill, H.R. 2456, and repeal the 2002 AUMF and Congressman Khanna's bill to prohibit any funds for a war with Iran absent an explicit authorization. My 2002 AUMF was included with bipartisan support in the House, passed in 2020, the NDAA bill, but it was stripped by Republicans from the final bill. Now I know why. Madam Speaker, this administration has falsely claimed that the 2002 AUMF could be used as a congressional authorization to attack Iran, which is completely outrageous. Let me be clear. U.S. military deployment and operations carried out pursuant to the 2002 AUMF.
Another 15 seconds.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The 2002 AUMF, it officially concluded in 2011. Maintaining this authorization is not only dangerous, but it's irresponsible. Madam Speaker, it's past time to return to diplomacy and end these endless wars. I urge an aye vote on HCON Resolution 3. Thank you again.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Mississippi, a Marine veteran of the Persian Gulf War and current member of the Mississippi National Guard, Mr. Palazzo.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to this resolution. Let's be clear with the American people. Democrats wrote this bill before being briefed by senior intelligence officials on the strike that eliminated Soleimani, a well-known terrorist. At the end of the day, we all know that this man was responsible for the death of thousands of individuals, including over 600 American service members. President Trump was absolutely right to respond and acted within his constitutional authority to protect American citizens. He owes no one an apology. Feelings can be healed, but dead Americans cannot be resurrected. My question for those on the other side of the aisle who are hell-bent on undermining this president over political differences is how many more Americans did you want to die before President Trump acted? Let's reflect. President Obama authorized over 540 drone strikes, killing over 3,700 people and more than 320 civilians. Not a single one was authorized by Congress. As a veteran and a member of our United States military, I am ashamed at the behavior I am witnessing now. Our military deserves better, and so do the American people. During a time where our country should unite behind our commander-in-chief, this resolution turns us against ourselves. I support our men and women in uniform and hope my colleagues on the left will come to their senses to do the same. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, for your leadership. I previously served on active duty in the United States military, and if we're going to put our troops in harm's way, we better have a strategy. Unfortunately, we don't have a strategy from the Trump administration. We just have reckless and impulsive decision-making by the president. Let me just ask a very simple question. What are our goals with Iran? Is it to get them to come back to the negotiating table on the nuclear program? Well, we're further away from that goal now because they've announced they're no longer going to abide by limits on their nuclear program. Or is the goal to get their regime to collapse? We're further from that goal too because the Iranian people who previously were protesting their government are now rallying behind their leadership. Or is the goal to work with our allies to contain Iran? Well, we're further away from that goal too because the Iraqi parliament just voted to kick us out of their country. We are less safe now than we were a week ago. Vote yes on this bipartisan resolution. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, many of the senior leadership on the other side of the aisle voted for the 2002 AUMF on Iraq, including the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the majority leader, and the chairman of Intel. The AUMF in 2002 gave this president every bit of authority he needed to go after a terrorist in Iraq. In fact, the terrorist that he killed, Soleimani, was designated under Barack Obama Executive Order 13224 as a specially designated global terrorist in 2011. Where was the outrage when President Obama was using the same AUMF as justification for dropping bombs in countries like Yemen or Syria, or violating the sovereign airspace of Pakistan, which we all agreed with? but violated the airspace of Pakistan to go in and kill Osama bin Laden? We were fine with that. This is a specially designated global terrorist who deserved the death after he was responsible for 600+ American deaths. This is an atrocious
The
and
gentleman's time's
abysmal
expired.
act, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Speaker, there's 2 times we're going to be called to account for our votes here in Congress. One is at our next election. The other is when we draw our last breath of air. I'm more concerned about the latter myself. This vote isn't about supporting or opposing President Trump. I voted for President Trump. I plan to vote for President Trump again. This vote is about exercising our constitutional authority, but more importantly, our moral obligation to decide when and where our troops are going to be asked to give their lives. Congress needs to do more of what we're doing here today. We need to debate our involvement in Afghanistan, and then we need to bring our troops home. We need to debate our involvement in Iraq, and then we need to bring our troops home. And we certainly don't need another war. And if we do go to war, it needs to be with the blessing and the support of the people and a mission that our soldiers can accomplish. And we do that by following the vision of our founding fathers. We debate it here on the floor of the House. That's what this resolution is about. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished Republican whip, Mr. Scalise.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague from Texas for yielding. And I rise in strong opposition to this resolution. And if you look at what they're attempting to do, there's been a lot of talk about the 2002 AUMF, Madam Speaker. And I'm sure, as Congress has over the years, we'll continue to have a healthy debate over what that proper role should be of Congress as it relates to the 2002 AUMF. But that's not what this debate is about. When you read the resolution, in fact, just by its own name, this is not an act of Congress. This isn't even changing the law. And so if you want to have a sincere debate over what that power should be that Congress gave to the executive branch, then let's have that debate. But don't try to pass some fig leaf resolution that is only intended to try to undermine the president in the middle of a conflict with the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. There's no dispute about how bad of an evil terrorist Soleimani was. But yet you hear all of these equivocations. Oh, Soleimani was a bad person, but how can you sit here and try to apologize for the things that he did by saying taking him out was wrong? This world is a safer place with Soleimani gone. And if you want to apologize to anybody, go apologize to the families of those hundreds of men and women in our uniform who are dead at the hands of Soleimani. Not only the people who he had already killed, but the people who he, at the very time of his death, was plotting to kill even more Americans. How much is enough? At what point do we say, take him off the face of this planet so he can't kill more innocent people? That's what was ultimately done. We support President Trump in his efforts at keeping America safe, just like we supported President Obama when he took out Osama bin Laden, another evil terrorist who had the blood of thousands of Americans on his hands. If we're going to be serious about keeping this country safe, absolutely there's a role for Congress to play, but you've got to support the efforts of your commander-in-chief to carry out his constitutional duty, which he has to keep this country safe. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 magic minute to our Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership in bringing this important opportunity for us to express our concern about the President's actions. I salute him, and I thank the support on the other side of the aisle for this legislation. As we know, last week the Trump administration conducted a provocative and disproportionate military airstrike targeting high-level Iranian military officials, and he did so without consulting Congress. When I first heard from the administration, the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I said, why did you not consult Congress in this change in approach? And they said, because we had to keep this close. We had to keep this close. You had to keep it close from the Gang of Eight, the leadership of the Congress. We had to keep it close because we didn't want the word to get out. Well, we deserve the respect from the administration, and the Congress deserves, by dint of the Constitution, the requirement of the administration to consult with Congress. We know full well, better than many in the administration, the importance of classified information. We know that we are supposed to support sources and methods. We also know that the consultation that they would give to us does not enable us to divulge any information. So who are they keeping it close from? They admitted, this administration, they were keeping it close from the Congress of the United States. And they did so. Now they did a classified presentation yesterday, which their own party members, Republican senators, said it was the most demeaning and worst classified briefing that they had had. I myself think there's stiff competition for that designation of worst presentation by this administration in a classified briefing. But all of that to say is the Constitution of the United States calls for there to be cooperation when we decide about initiating hostilities. Congress has the right to declare war. When do you decide that it is war? When do you decide it's just hostilities? When does that all end? What line do you cross? But with the president's actions last week, he endangered our servicemen and women, our diplomats, and others by taking a serious risk of escalation with tensions with Iran. This does not come with any respect for Iran. We know what bad actors they are in the world. We know that Soleimani, I from my intelligence background know that Soleimani was somebody that we do not mourn the loss of, he did very evil things in the world. But we also know that when we take an action, we have to understand the ramifications of it. Others could have taken Soleimani out. Israel could have taken Soleimani out. But they didn't. So that's happened. That's where it is. As we go forward, it was really important for us to address the parameters of the War Powers Act, and that is what we are doing here today. The members of Congress have serious and urgent concerns about the administration's decision to engage, I use the term decision loosely, to engage in hostilities against Iran, and it's about a lack of strategy. What is the strategy to move forward? Again, I did not consult with Congress. They gave a presentation that by their own side of the aisle has been described as demeaning and the worst. And then they tell members to go read the classified documents. Classified. Why are these documents classified? Why can't the American people know? We understand redaction of sources and methods and the rest, but if you read that document, you would know there is no reason for it to be classified. And without going into any substantive matters of what happened yesterday in the classified briefing, it's fair to say that we were told, members were told, to go read other documents, which are redacted and, in many cases, classified unnecessarily. Our concerns were not addressed by the President's insufficient war powers authorization, which was classified in its entirety, leaving the Congress and the public in the dark about our national security. And our concerns were not addressed by the administration's briefing yesterday. Today, to honor our duty to keep the American people safe, that is our first responsibility, to protect and defend. We must keep the American people safe. The House will pass a war powers resolution to limit the President's military actions regarding Iran. Congress is reassuring our long-established oversight responsibilities as we mandate that if no further congressional action is taken, The administration's military hostilities with regard to Iran must end. We salute Congresswoman Slotkin for her leadership in this resolution. She's a former CIA and Department of Defense analyst specializing in Shia militias who served multiple tours in the region under both Democratic and Republican presidents. It's important to note, because I heard the distinguished whip on the other side of the aisle say, how come it's just a concurrent resolution? It is because under the War Powers Act, that is one of the options that is provided. You can do a joint resolution, House resolution, or you can do a concurrent resolution. The value and the beauty and the exquisite nature of a concurrent resolution is that it does not have to be signed by the President of the United States. The Congress of the United States, in its full power and full voice, can speak in a united way about what the War Powers Act should look like. And that should count for something to our colleagues who serve in the Congress of the United States. And so under the authority of the War Powers Act that gives us this option, we take this opportunity to do so. I implore the administration to work with Congress to advance immediate, effective de-escalatory strategy that prevents further violence. I also salute this resolution because it does give opportunity for the administration to act under certain circumstances, which are part of the War Powers Act. Madam Speaker, on December, a group of us in a bipartisan way, we traveled to Belgium and Luxembourg to observe the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Some of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle had family members who served in that battle. One of ours, Annie Custer, her father, served in that, and she has letters from him at that time, and others, members on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Moulton, Seth Moulton, his grandfather served in the Battle of the Bulge, but also on the Republican side of the aisle, in the House and in the Senate. And why I bring it up is this, because that Battle of the Bulge was a decisive battle in World War II. It was a surprise attack, really, by the Germans. It was a bloody battle. We lost 19,000 Americans, 19,000 Americans in that Battle of the Bulge. When I was listening to the description of it on the days that we were there from the veterans who served, it sounded almost like Washington crossing the Delaware, because it was December, as it was in the United States at the beginning of our fight for independence. The supplies were insufficient. The camouflage for snow was not adequate. Our veterans, our men then, men in uniform were exposed, nurses too. And it was a triumph that decided, it was very decisive in World War II. And why I bring it up is because when there was the observance of it, with 3 days, parts of 3 days we were there for it, but the close of it, there was a ceremony that included a speech by the King of Belgium, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, two of the places where this all took place, the President of Germany, who spoke beautifully about Germany now, and saying when you freed Luxembourg and Belgium, you also freed the Germans. What a beautiful statement. But the close of it was from a veteran who served in the Battle of the Bulge in his 90s, was a teenager in the war. We saw the foxholes in which they fought. They lost their comrades in arms. He talked about the brotherhood, and he talked about the allies, and he talked about the fight. And at the end of the speech, the veteran said, "I don't know if I should say this, but I will. My message to all of you is pray for peace. Pray for peace." That's what we should be doing, is moving toward peace, not escalation of hostilities, where that can be avoided. Not because we believe that the other side has good motivations, or that Soleimani was not a bad person. It's not because of what they are. It's because of who we are as Americans. A country that is committed to peace and security and prepared to protect and defend. As President Kennedy said, fight any fight, fight any foe, pay any price to keep the American people safe. But to not be frivolous and cavalier about how we decide to show strength when it really is more of an escalation than a de-escalation. So it's sad because you would think that any time we would engage in such an important change in approach that we would be working together, consulting together, respecting the approach that each side takes to all of this and hopefully just be on one side of it all. So I think this is a very important, it doesn't do everything, but you say, well, it doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. We should never be judging legislation necessarily for what it doesn't do, but respecting it for what it does do. And what this does is very important for the security of our country. I urge a yes vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Alabama, the ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the ranking member. I rise in strong opposition to this brazen political stunt. Qasem Soleimani was a vicious terrorist who built a cult following on the backs of dead Americans. He armed Hezbollah, KH, and other Iranian proxies who killed American troops and our allies throughout the Middle East. The Homeland Security and Defense Departments have kept close watch on his terror campaigns for years. Soleimani was not visiting Baghdad because it was a great holiday destination. He was there to meet the leader of a terrorist group that killed an American just days before. Our president used the law and his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief to eliminate this terrorist mastermind before he could kill again. Democrats immediately responded by doubting our intelligence and dismissing the expertise of our military leaders. Now they bring this resolution to the floor that maligns our president, undermines our national security, and makes a martyr of a man who killed nearly 600 Americans. I urge a no vote and yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 2 minutes to the Majority Whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I thank my friend for yielding their time. Speaking out against the Vietnam War in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. implored, we must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Dr. King's words are just as apropos today. President Trump, in ordering a significant military strike against authorization without seeking authorization or even consultation with the Congress, has brought us to the brink of war. The Constitution of this great country gives the solemn power to declare war to the people's representatives in Congress, not one person in the White House, whoever that might be. With this resolution, Congress is acting to uphold our constitutional responsibility. If the President believes military action against Iran is warranted, this resolution and the Constitution require him to make the case to Congress and receive authorization. Mr. Speaker, I truly regret that we find ourselves in the position we are today. The Trump administration's policy toward Iran, abandoning the nuclear deal rather than building on it while escalating tensions instead, is an unwise application of American power, might, and strength. The strike against General Soleimani, a bad man who no American mourns, drags us closer to another long, dark, and shameful corridor to an unnecessary war. I urge the adoption of the resolution. Now yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our Constitution is clear that only Congress can start a war, but only the President can wage it. Congress started this war with the AUMF in 2002. It's still in effect. The founders didn't want one individual getting us into a war, but once in it, they didn't want 535 squabbling prima donnas second-guessing every decision on the battlefield. President Trump needed no other reason to order the attack that killed Soleimani in Iraq beyond the simple fact that he was acting as an enemy combatant against U.S. forces in a war zone in which the Congress had authorized the president to take military action. Now, I happen to believe the AUMF was a colossal mistake. But this resolution doesn't correct that mistake. It compounds it by deliberately undermining the position of the United States government and the armed forces that we sent to Iraq at a perilous moment, which makes it not only unconstitutional, but disgraceful. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last few days, the American people have been unwillingly taken to the brink of war at the direction of this administration. Through reckless actions, the White House has unified the Iranian public, alienated our partners in Iraq and Europe, undermined the fight against ISIS, and left the United States more isolated than before, all in just 1 week and without the consent of this Congress. This is a grave and serious moment in our country. 2 days ago, our brave men and women in uniform came under fire from 22 Iranian missiles, in harm's way because of their commander-in-chief. Every American owes a debt of gratitude to our military for its courage and sacrifice. For that reason, a decision that risks troops' well-being must only be made thoughtfully and with the informed consent of the public and this Congress. As a member of Congress, my biggest priority is to protect the safety of the American people at home and abroad. This can only be done by defending Congress's constitutional authority over declaring war. And for that reason, I urge us to support this resolution.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Major Ronald Culver Jr., Corporal Justin Mixon, Sergeant Joseph Richard III, Sergeant Terrell Gilmore, Staff Sergeant Jared Fontenot, Corporal William Crouch, Private Mark Graham, Staff Sergeant Ronnie Sanders, Staff Sergeant Jared McMillan, Sergeant Joshua Winton, Sergeant Ty Guthrow, Private Joshua Burrows, Corporal Joseph Duras, Lance Corporal John Bowman, Lance Corporal John Hell, Sergeant Matthew Westman, Sergeant First Class Terry Wallace, Sergeant Burry Testers, Lance Corporal Derek Cottom, Staff Sergeant Brian Lewis, Sergeant Julian Atkins, Sergeant William Partridge, Corporal David Stewart.
Additional 30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds is granted.
Sergeant David Murray, First Sergeant Michael Bordelon, Sergeant Nicholas Oliver, Sergeant Seth Trahan, Staff Sergeant Jonathan Reed, Staff Sergeant Christopher Ramsey, Sergeant Michael Evans, Sergeant Robert Sweeney, Staff Sergeant William Manuel. And Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter the rest of my testimony into the record.
Without objection. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the resolution before us today. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states, quote, Congress shall have the power to declare war, end quote. The founders were unequivocal. Only Congress has the power to authorize acts of war. Today, we bring forth this resolution to honor our founding fathers' vision for our country, for our government, one whose very survival hinges on the separation of powers and each branch's respect for the other's authority. At this moment, we as a Congress have an opportunity to pursue de-escalatory actions that protect the lives of our armed forces, diplomats, and civilians. And I implore the President and this administration to work with this Congress in this effort. Today marks this first step. We must aggressively pursue diplomacy so that no lives are lost. I encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join in that pursuit. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution. I urge a yes vote. I yield back.
The gentleman's reserves. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you to the ranking member, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of a president who carried out his oath of office. I'm afraid the reason we are here today, again, is out of pure opposition to this president and not the serious national security issues at hand. Make no mistake, terrorist Soleimani is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans, including those that my friend and colleague Ralph Abraham just read. Hundreds of Americans. And he was plotting to kill many more. The President used his full legal authority to take defensive action and eliminate this brutal terrorist. The world is safer today because of it. In times like these, we need to come together as a country and stand behind our men and women in uniform. Whoever occupies the White House should have the ability to direct and address threats and prevent American bloodshed. Just 48 hours ago, Iran attacked U.S. military personnel, and yet we are hastily voting on this partisan resolution that will weaken national security. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this political show resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capter.
Gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and rise in support of the War Powers Resolution as an original co-sponsor. This is a grave and pivotal moment in American history, and we must be greatly concerned for the security of our troops and the safety of the American people. We live in an era of hybrid warfare and high-intensity reaction. One reckless military strike can incentivize countermeasures, not just in the immediate region, but thousands of miles away by Iran's proxies. Wise use of force matters. Without congressional authorization and in defiance of our Constitution, this president ordered an unprecedented strike on Iran's top generals. There is no doubt Soleimani was a fierce enemy of liberty. However, this Lone Ranger attack by the president risks all-out war, greater instability in Iraq and Iran, losing the edge we have gained at such great cost. And some of those names have been put on the record today. We must protect against further attacks on our service members and attacks on U.S. assets wherever they might exist. Might I have an additional 15 seconds?
Gentlewoman, I request additional 15 seconds for the gentlewoman.
Gentleman may proceed.
Thank you. To those ends, the American people deserve full transparency. The President must take steps to de-escalate this highly volatile situation in the most ungovernable part of the world. Let us rigorously pursue with our allies turning back Iran's development of nuclear weapons, and let us do all we can to uphold our beloved Constitution, put raging bulls back in their cages, and make the American people safer. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from the great state of Texas, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank my friend and fellow Texan ranking member, Mr. McCall, for his strong leadership. Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to weaponize impeachment to discredit the president. It's a whole nother thing to handcuff our commander-in-chief and jeopardize the safety of our soldiers and prevent them from defending themselves. Thankfully, this is a partisan resolution that's going nowhere, but it's also disturbing insight into the naive and impotent ideology of appeasement that invited Russia into Syria, created ISIS in Iraq, and emboldened Iran to terrorize and brutally murder throughout the Middle East. This is not a resolution, this is a retreat, a de facto apology. But for what? For ridding the world of a brutal terrorist with American blood on his hands? If this resolution were to become law, Mr. Speaker, it would be a death warrant, and not for the worst of terrorists, but for the best of Americans, our sons and daughters on the battlefield who would be left defenseless, sitting ducks for a murderous mob of mullahs in Iran and Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
The gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized.
It is past time for Congress to exert our authority over the questions of war and peace, and I am proud to vote for this concurrent resolution to invoke the War Powers Act in order to restrain this reckless president. This vote would halt military operations and force the president to come to Congress to authorize any further acts of war. The president remarkably said, "All is well." Well, Mr. President, it is not well. Iran announced that it would withdraw from the nuclear agreement and will begin to resume its nuclear weapons plan. The United States has been forced to stop its actions against ISIS. Iraq is likely to expel the United States from its country, fulfilling what has been a dream, actually, of Soleimani. Our European allies are angry because they were not alerted, and our actions have united the people of Iraq against us. And Iran are together now. Mr. President, America is not safer because of what you've done, and we must pass this resolution.
Members are reminded to direct their marks to the chair. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield a magic minute. Those magic minutes are wonderful. To the Majority Leader of the House, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Let us hope that demagoguery will not play too great a part in the consideration of this piece of legislation. I just heard one of my colleagues on the other side mischaracterize the position of my party and of this resolution. This resolution is the law. This resolution is consistent with not only the law, the War Powers Act, but the Constitution of the United States. And I want to thank Representative Slotkin for authoring this resolution, as well as Chairman Smith, Chairman Engel, Representative Khanna, Representative Lee, and others who have been working hard to ensure that Congress maintains its role as a co-equal branch of government when it comes to matters of war and peace.
This president, as we have seen, has consistently treated the legislative branch as inferior to the executive. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, we've had numerous votes on this floor last year to stand up for the co-equal status of the Congress of the United States. And too often our Republican friends have sided with the executive department, diminishing the authority and the position of the Congress of the United States. This is not about this president, nor is it about shrinking from confronting terrorism and terrorists. Again and again, we have seen this president ignore Congress's directives on appropriations, including by shifting money away from the military to fund his costly and ineffective border wars. He has refused to disperse emergency funding for disaster relief that Congress allocated to help the people of Puerto Rico and other places where Americans are in need of help. And he withheld congressionally appropriated funding to help Ukraine repel Russian terrorism. After criticizing his predecessor for the use of executive orders, President Trump has doubled down on using them to circumvent the will of Congress and the American people. All this resolution is say, Mr. President, obey the law. Obey the Constitution of the United States of America, which gives to the Congress the sole authority to declare war. And if you read the language of the resolution, it continues to say that we are for certainly defending any of our people at risk, period. The War Powers Act provides for that. Article 2 of the Constitution provides for that. But the President has ignored congressional subpoenas for documents and testimony directing subordinates to build a wall of obstruction unseen in our history. It should therefore be no surprise that we representatives of the 320 million plus people of America who expect us to be their voice in this critical issue of declaring war. And this resolution does not prohibit in any way the President of the United States, under his Article 2 powers, acting to defend our military, our allies, and our homeland. Now, with the actions taken last week, he is unilaterally moving us toward an involvement in another deadly and destabilizing war in the Middle East. Now, I'm glad, very frankly, that, as we all are, that the response that came from Iran was either ineffective or meant to be simply a message. I don't know which. Thankfully, however, the Congress has under law and our Constitution a remedy to reassert our position as a co-equal branch, as a matter of fact, an Article 1 branch, ensure, as the founders intended, that only the Congress, speaking on behalf of all of the people, could declare war. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973 because they believed a Democratic president, and it was a Democratic Congress that adopted the War Powers Act, because they believed a Democratic president had overstepped the bounds. Congress passed the War Powers Act in 1973, determined to ensure that no president can send our troops into war without the people's representatives authoring it. I suggest to my friends on both sides of the aisle, that is what the founders intended. We must use this tool of congressional power, or by our silence acquiesce to the growth of the imperial presidency, which, by the way, has been going on for some 40 years, maybe even 50 years, irrespective of who is president. This is not a partisan resolution. This is a resolution consistent with the Constitution of the United States of America, who did not want a single person to be able to take America to war, to put our men and women at risk. Let us be absolutely clear. Qasem Soleimani was a dangerous purveyor of terror and violence and a practice thereof. He was an architect of Iranian efforts to dominate the Middle East through aggression and fear. He has American blood on his hands as well as the blood of our allies. He has met the justice he deserves. I say that notwithstanding the fact I do not know from the information I have received whether or not, in fact, it was absolutely essential to take his life now because of imminent danger. Perhaps it was. But in any event, no one laments the loss of Soleimani's life, at least in this country and freedom-loving people throughout the world. And we are relieved that the Iranian counterstrike was limited and caused no American or Allied casualties. But, Mr. Speaker, my constituents and the American people are deeply concerned about what comes next, with a possibility of further retaliation and escalation from Iran or its proxies. There may be a time when such action is called for. But it is this body that needs to make that decision, and the United States Senate. This body. It continues, Iran is a dangerous enemy of freedom and a sponsor of terror. It continues to harbor ambitions of dominance over its neighbors and to call for the destruction of Israel. This Iranian regime is no friend and must not be trusted. Iran must never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. I believe this Congress would vote to ensure that that was prohibited. This resolution makes those facts clear. We must have a sound, long-term strategy to deal with Iran and bring it into compliance with international laws and norms. The threat of military force must continue to be a part of any strategy, along with sanctions and diplomacy. And this resolution in no way countervenes that premise. The best way forward is for Congress and the administration to work together. That's what our founders had in mind. Proper congressional oversight and involvement will help ensure, not undermine, that the administration adopts and pursues the best possible strategy to check and oppose Iran's malign ambitions. Let us not demagogue one another. There can be differences. But this resolution is brought to this floor of the House to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America and to again urge this president, as we have urged Democratic presidents, to ensure that they follow the strictures of our Constitution on behalf of the safety of our people and the respect we have throughout the world. We're a nation of laws. This resolution is about the laws. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Let me say I have great respect for the leader, and I do not disagree with him that the president needs to come to Congress to authorize war with Iran. But that is not what we were looking at here today. We do not currently have troops engaged in hostility in Iran, subject to withdrawal under the War Powers Resolution. However, if the administration were to strike Iran directly, in my opinion, they would need to submit a War Powers notification, and they would also need to proceed with an authorized use of military force. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Spano.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member McCall. I oppose this resolution. The Speaker claims that it is a necessary response to President Trump's, quote, disproportionate attack on a high-level Iranian military official. Disproportionate. Apparently, Democrats have forgotten who Qasem Soleimani was, one of the worst perpetrators of terror in recent history. He led the organization that founded Hezbollah, one of the most violent terrorist groups opposing Israel. He directed his groups to kill over 600 American service members in Iraq and wound thousands more. He led a brutal attack on peaceful protesters recently in Iran, killing over 1,000 Iranians. A bully will not stand down unless he knows you are willing to stand toe-to-toe with him, unless he knows there are consequences to his actions. And President Trump acted decisively in bringing down this brutal, inhumane bully, this terrorist mastermind, to stop an imminent threat. It was necessary to show Iran we will no longer tolerate their aggression. We should be united in our support for eliminating this threat and in supporting the President's efforts to negotiate a new, more effective Iran deal. And I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution so that all options are on the table and we can negotiate from a position of strength toward achieving a peaceful solution. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this concurrent resolution, which requires President Trump to immediately terminate military operations against Iran. It's about time that Congress exercised its War Powers Act, powers authority under the Constitution. I believe this is long overdue. Now, the President has taken our nation to the brink of war without properly consulting Congress or seeking the legal authority to do so. Only Congress can authorize military action under Article 1 of the Constitution. And to add insult to injury, the Trump administration has failed to fully explain to Congress and the American people what exactly the imminent threat was to the United States that required the strike that was undertaken. My constituents and people across the country have been terrified about the prospect of a new war in the Middle East. Now, let me be clear. No member of Congress carries a brief for Soleimani or the Iranian government.
I yield the gentlewoman an extra 15 seconds.
I thank the
Gentlewoman
gentleman.
may
But
continue.
no president has unilateral authority to take our nation to war without authorization from Congress. I urge my colleagues to vote yes.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Speaker, if it were but a matter of offering 3 cheers for the legislative branch, that would be fine, but this is dangerous and simply makes no sense. If the majority wished to assert Congress's authority, as several have argued, it would not use a non-binding resolution. But let me take the majority at its chosen words, as if binding. The words of the resolution would literally prohibit the President from ordering the shoot-down of Iranian ballistic missiles inbound for Haifa, or a surface-to-air missile locked onto a Ukrainian airliner. And the resolution's chosen words, as Democrats argue them, would prevent the President from the strike on Soleimani itself, even if devastating harm to American soldiers were imminent. But Democrats second-guessed that judgment. The language you have chosen is designed to debilitate the President from protecting Americans. The intemperate words of the past week have cost many their credibility. Now, Democrats' spite for President Trump has cost them their good judgment. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Davis.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I voted against the 2002 AUMF. In coming to that very difficult decision, I learned an important lesson, that we must ask every administration that seeks to use military force, how will it manage the consequences of its actions, even if those actions can be justified? Has this administration done that? Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. I will vote for this resolution today for the same reasons I had then. No overall strategy, no justification, and nobody in this administration can answer how it will respond to the aftermath. By virtue of the power and the responsibility granted to us by the Constitution, we must ask those questions. Let's take this opportunity to make diplomacy work. Let's stand together as the Congress to establish our authority. Let's stand together and vote against a new war without an endgame. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Abraham.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Sergeant First Class Kurt Como, Sergeant Christopher Babin, Sergeant Bradley Bergeron, Sergeant Huey Fassbender, Sergeant Armand Fricke, Sergeant Warren Murphy, Sergeant Craig Nelson, First Lieutenant Christopher Barnett, Private First Class Tori Dantzler, Private First Class James Lambert, Sergeant Taft Williams. I want to thank the ranking member, Chairman McCall, for giving me additional time to finish the list that I started earlier. These are 44 young Americans that died from Louisiana by IEDs in the most active part of Iraq when Soleimani and his proxies were engaged. They designed, they built, and they implemented these IEDs. And in Louisiana alone, 44 young Americans gave their lives for the United States of America. President Trump, he had the authority, he has the right, and thankfully he had the courage to terminate Soleimani and remove this cancer from this earth. And to my Democratic colleagues and friends, I say, if you can look these Gold Star families in the face and tell them that this was not a justified strike and that Soleimani needed to be removed from this earth, then God have mercy on you. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we may be relieved that an impulsive act by President Trump has not immediately led to war with Iran. We may be relieved that an evil man is dead. But as that evil man wished, our troops have now been asked to leave Iraq, and if they stay, their ability to work with Iraqis to fight ISIS has been shot. As he wished, the protest movement in Iran and Iraq that threatened the Iranian regime has been silenced. As he wished, Iran is now breaking free of all restrictions on its nuclear program. We are not safer today. And in this moment of danger, there is just one question that this resolution asks. Not do you support what the president has already done, but should Congress play our constitutional role in deciding what happens next? I support this resolution because passing it will protect us against going to war with a tweet, but it also ensures that if we do go to war, which we may have to at some point, we will do so with the American people united, not divided, as the framers intended, as our national interest demands. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cisneros.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in defense of our Constitution and express the urgent need of Congress to reestablish itself as an equal branch of government. Our founders explicitly laid out the roles and responsibilities of the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches, creating a necessary system of checks and balances. But today we find our democratic system in jeopardy. In the past week, there has been an increasing concern about the United States going to war with Iran. Let me be very clear. If and when President decides to use military action, he must go through Congress first. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to declare war. Any attempt to undermine the power would be unsafe, unacceptable, and unconstitutional. As a Navy veteran, I am constantly thinking of our brave service members. It's why I take this constitutional responsibility seriously. We cannot turn our backs to our principles, we cannot turn our backs to our values, and we cannot turn our backs to the Constitution. I look forward to voting for the War Powers Resolution and taking Congress's power back. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my good friend. I rise with great frustration in opposition to this politically motivated resolution. It is nothing but a blatant attempt to handcuff the President's ability to defend our citizens and our allies. Just this morning, U.S. intelligence officials reported that they are now confident that the Ukraine airline 752 was shot down by Iranian surface-to-air missiles. Another 176 innocent lives lost. The Islamic Republic of Iran has been hostile to our nation for decades, and yet it has certainly escalated in the last several months with a campaign of antagonistic military action. Have my Democratic colleagues forgotten about the shipping vessels sabotaged by naval mines last May and June, or the American drone shot down over international waters, or the British oil tanker seized by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or the Saudi oil facilities that were attacked? And then when an American citizen was killed in an attack on Kirkuk Air Base in December, and our embassy in Iraq subsequently overrun, our president drew a line in the sand. Yet after months of tremendous restraint, the president was determined that not one more American life would be lost at this Iranian regime, and I fully support the president in his actions. I do agree with many of my colleagues that it's time for this body to have a serious conversation and to address the many issues inherent with operating under a 20-plus-year-old authorization for military force, but that should not be confused with the process that's taking place here with this resolution. This is nothing but another attempt by the majority. 15.
Be happy to yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
Thank you. This is nothing but an attempt by the majority in a 3-year-long process by their party to take any and every opportunity to undermine or embarrass this president. But be assured that this politically motivated resolution, nor any evil that comes our way, will cause our president to hesitate when called upon to defend American lives. And I just say, God bless the president, God bless America, and with that I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Well, I would say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, please don't question our motives or patriotism, and we won't question yours. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of this resolution that reasserts congressional authority over going to war. We know this: war is devastating for our troops, for their families, for families and children everywhere, for not just this generation, but future generations to come, for our humanity. And that is why our framers gave this body the opportunity, the responsibility to have that discussion and declare war should it be needed. In 2002, we rushed to war based on made-up claims of weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq war and Afghanistan wars took hundreds of thousands of lives, created millions of refugees, and cost us trillions of dollars. Today, the president, without providing any raw intelligence to prove an imminent threat, has brought us to the brink of war with Iran. So this resolution makes it clear that Congress has not authorized this war. We also must repeal the 2002 AUMF and vote to withhold funds for this unauthorized war. It is time to reassert our authority. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib.
The gentlewoman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of 13 District Strong. This is a district that believes in leading with compassion. They believe in a full stop to endless violent wars that only result in loss of life and the destruction of lives forever changed. For us, Mr. Speaker, it is important to protect our democracy and promote global peace. We must remove political motives and for-profit schemes from the decision-making process to go to war. If we don't, it would only lead to more warfare and death. We cannot allow a process that is tainted, secretive, or encompasses lies to make that choice. We need a country that easily chooses peace for generations to come. I proudly represent a district that believes in the rule of law. That is why I rise today as their voice in support of a war powers resolution that will give them a say in whether or not our country goes to war. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Green.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in complete opposition to this resolution. First, this is a non-binding resolution. If you really wanted to exert some congressional decision-making, we'd do a bill that goes before the president and gets signed or gets vetoed. This is purely theatrics. None of these Democrat leaders stood up when President Obama violated the airspace of Pakistan to take out Osama bin Laden. Now, I'm glad he did that. But he violated, there was no congressional authorization to go into Pakistan. At least here, there's a congressional authorization for our forces to be on the ground and using military power. The president has clear authority under Article 2 to act when our nation and our military is at risk. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, and I quote, "The trigger for the drone strike that killed Soleimani was clear, unambiguous intelligence indicating a significant campaign of violence against the United States in the days, weeks, and months, and that the administration would have been culpably negligent if it didn't act." General Mark Milley. These people understand one thing, and it's strength. You'll recall that when President Clinton pulled our forces out of Somalia after we got the black eye on Black Hawk Down, bin Laden cited that as proof that the Americans run away, that they won't stand and fight. I've been to combat 3 times in this region of the world, twice in Iraq and once in Afghanistan. I've looked these individuals in the eye. It's strength that they understand, and clearly it's shown itself to be true again. This president stood up, and Iran's response was clear. They had 2 audiences in their response. At home, they wanted people to see strength. They shot 15 missiles. They're back in their press saying they killed Americans. They didn't, of course. The other audience, the United States and the rest of the world, they fired 16 missiles. All 16 missed. All 16 missiles missed. Remember, when they hit Saudi Arabia, all those missiles hit. They know how to hit their target. They fired 16 missiles against us and not a one hit. What's the message they're saying? Immediately after they fired him, they stood up and said, "We're done. No more. That's the end of our response." They told the Shia militia groups to stand down. And Muqtada al-Sadr said to his people today, "Stand down." They respond to strength. And our president did the right thing. He was a strong response to storming sovereign U.S. territory of an embassy with 6,000 people, killing American contractors and wounding American soldiers with a rocket attack. Mr. Speaker, this president made a strong response, and it's shown itself to work. I yield.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. I just can't really believe what I just heard. It was the 2001 AUMF specifically authorized our going after Osama bin Laden. He's the example of Congress getting involved. That was the authorization to get Osama bin Laden in Pakistan or anyplace else. And that's what we're trying to assure here, that things aren't just happening, that there is actual authority. And Osama bin Laden is the wrong example because we gave the authority to go after him. I yield 1 minute to a gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the mother of a United States Marine War veteran, I came to Congress with the promise of never sending someone else's child to a war that could be avoided. This War Powers Resolution says no war with Iran without congressional approval, while still ensuring defense if there's an imminent threat. While we do not mourn the death of Iran's commander of terror, Americans and our allies worry about the ramifications will make us less safe. The fight against ISIS has been diverted. Regional protests against the Iranian regime are now against America. Iranian proxies have been further incited, and Iran is closer to having a nuclear weapon. America is not a monarchy. The decision to go to war requires debate, deliberation, and collective judgment. That's why the law gives the responsibility to Congress. I urge support of this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, at this point, I'll continue to reserve until Chairman Engel is prepared to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, Mr. Engel, for yielding. I'm troubled by aspects of this debate. I think it's fine that we have different views, but to hear some on the other side characterize the position of those who support this resolution as somehow not loving the country as much as they do, when it's our country as well that we pledge to defend. It's the same veterans on this side of the aisle that put themselves in harm's way as the veterans on the other side of the aisle. There's no distinction in the battlefield. We love our children and want to defend them as much as we know you do as well. So let's stop the demagoguery regarding patriotism. This comes to a simple question. And it's not even a question as to whether or not there was justification to take out Mr. Soleimani, because clearly there was. The question is who gives the justification? Who authorizes military action in this country? We can all have our opinions, but we ought to consult the Constitution that vests.
Yield the gentleman 15 additional seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
Thank you. We ought to consult the Constitution, which clearly vests that authority in this Congress. We ought not fear that authority and outsource it to the executive branch. We ought to embrace that authority and be willing to make that decision and follow the Constitution. I thank the gentleman. And I yield
Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia is recognized.
I thank my good friend for yielding.
Congress has long been absent without leave from its constitutional responsibility to authorize war before it occurs. From Vietnam to Iran, the verdict on the War Powers Act is clear. You lose it if you do not use it. Congress chafes at outside presidential power, but has failed to exercise its own advice and consent power on war. Iran has stepped back for now from the brink of war following the killing of General Soleimani, but a strong bipartisan 69% of the American people say that war with Iran is now more likely. No wonder, considering that we have just deployed 15,000 more troops to the region. Trying to get answers after the fact, as Congress did in yesterday's briefing, yielded frustration, not answers. Unchecked executive power unbalances the safeguards against arbitrary power the framers built into our Constitution. With passage of today's resolution, we will reclaim that balance by reinserting Congress into decisions to go to war.
The gentleman from Texas, continue to reserve. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Okay. I now yield 1 minute to a very valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the chairman of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this War Powers resolution, and I thank my colleague from Michigan, Representative Slotkin, for leading this effort today to assert Congress's rightful authority and to defend our solemn constitutional duty. None of us want to see our brave men and women sent into another war. To be clear, this vote is not about telling the administration that the president can't defend this country. My colleagues know that. They understand it. I strongly reject any implication that somehow by supporting this resolution, we don't take our national security and the safety of our service members seriously. To the contrary, nothing we do today limits the ability to respond to a real and imminent threat or defend this country and our interests. To assert so is simply false, and it is reckless. Today, we're telling the president that if there is a serious threat to the United States, our national security requires that a solemn decision is made to engage U.S. forces. The elected representatives of this body have to have.
The gentleman may continue.
I thank my friend. The elected representatives of the American people need to have that case made to them. Congress needs to have a robust debate about any authorization for the use of military force. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I urge my colleagues to uphold the Constitution, and I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Getz.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I take a backseat to no member of this body when it comes to defending the president. This resolution offers no criticism of the president, no critique. It doesn't criticize the president's attack on Soleimani. Matter of fact, this resolution doesn't even say Soleimani's name in it. Yet, it does articulate our very robust basis for self-defense, at times even preemptory self-defense to defend our troops. And it also articulates our non-delegable duty as members of the United States Congress to speak to matters of war and peace. I represent more troops than any other member of this body. I buried one of them earlier today at Arlington. And that sergeant died a patriot and a hero. If the members of our armed services have the courage to go and fight and die in these wars, as Congress, we ought to have the courage to vote for them or against them. And I think it's ludicrous to suggest that we are impairing the troops from doing their job by not doing our job articulated in the Constitution to speak to these matters of war and peace. I support the president. Killing Soleimani was the right decision, but engaging in another forever war in the Middle East would be the wrong decision, and that's why I'm voting for this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker,
The system of checks and balances is broken. Last week's airstrike proves it. After the strike, the administration produced a vague document that attempts justifying America's push to the brink of war. Mr. Chairman, I fought in a war started by a president with false and trumped-up intelligence. We cannot let this president do the same. Americans deserve to read the declassified report so they can judge for themselves whether the strike was worth the risk. They'll find an administration shooting from the hip with no strategy to deal with Iran. It's time for Congress to lead and exercise the authority the founders gave us in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It's time to tell the president he cannot send our troops to war with Iran without a strategy and without the consent of their representatives. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump's strategy to counter Iran has failed. He has allowed Iran to restart its nuclear weapons program, disrupted our operations countering ISIS, continues to undermine our relationship with NATO allies, and has led America to the brink of a new and unnecessary war. As someone who served in Iraq, I understand the costs of war, how our soldiers put their lives on the line, and the impact these decisions have on military families. Our founders entrusted Congress with the responsibility to declare war. Congress owes it to the American people and our men and women in uniform to carry out that responsibility. It's time for Congress to declare that war with Iran is not in the best interests of the American people. It is time for Congress to repeal the 2002 AUMF and dramatically restrict the 2001 AUMF. And until we can do that, we must prevent the president from unilaterally committing the United States to yet another war in the Middle East. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve?
No, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman. I was sitting in my office and watching this debate, and I began to wonder who it is that we're actually debating against, or what it is that we're debating against. And I think back to the killing of Osama bin Laden, when we stood together as a United States and saying this was the right thing to do at the right time because it would save lives. The only thing we regret is that we didn't do it sooner when we had a chance to take him out. But we delayed because we weren't sure. I've gone back and read what President Obama said, and he says, I made this decision on my own. Yet today we stand in the people's house, and we're worried more about the loss of an election in 2020 than the loss of American lives and the continued loss of lives around the world by one of the worst terrorists of all time. And we sit here and try to pretend this charade is what we're really concerned about, is giving too much power to this president. This is a president who acts boldly. This is a president who carried out a strike that was so precise, so strategic, nothing else was hurt except the car in which that terrorist was riding in. And yet we sit here today and say, our problem in America isn't terrorists around the world. Our problem is in America is we have a president who's too damn strong. The rest of the world knows today that our enemies certainly do fear us because they know there's a deterrent in the White House. And our friends and allies know that America will always be there. We'll always be there if we say we're going to be there, and we will always stand up for the values that this country has always stood for. To have this debate tonight and this resolution is not about securing America or making America safer. This is about taking powers away from the President of the United States. And we can call this anything we want to say, not just this president, but any president in the future. My God, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This, the people's house, and our biggest responsibility is protecting our American citizens. And we're having this debate tonight. Please do not tell me this is about taking away the authorization for military force. This is about taking away powers from the most strong president we've had. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
You know, again, I think it would be helpful if people's motives or patriotism wasn't questioned. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Schneider.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the War Powers Resolution introduced by my colleague from Michigan, Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin. Soleimani was an evil man, a terrorist, a war criminal. No one should mourn his demise. But that doesn't change the question of who has the authority to take our nation into war. It is Congress, and only Congress, that is endowed with the most solemn duty to decide if, when, and where to commit our nation to war. At the same time, as Commander-in-Chief, it is incumbent upon our President to ensure that the fine men and women who serve in our military are only sent into harm's way after careful deliberation and tasked with missions that protect and further America's interests and reflect the values and high moral standing of our nation. Our country's founders, in their foresight, provided us a robust and resilient constitutional republic and representative government. They wisely understood that taking a nation to war should not be a unilateral decision by a single person, but a considered decision by the people's elected representatives. This administration does not have congressional authorization for use of military force or a declaration of war against Iran. Ultimately, any sustained action against Iran requires congressional approval. Today's resolution reflects the intentions of our founders. It makes clear the President must seek authorization from Congress for any extended military engagement with Iran without restricting his ability to protect the nation from imminent threat. I have the honor of representing Naval Station Great Lakes, where every enlisted sailor receives his or her basic training. I am the proud father of a son serving in our Navy. We owe it to these Americans, each one a volunteer answering the call to serve our country, to protect this Constitution, and live up to the expectations of our founders. The American people do not want an unnecessary war with Iran. Today's resolution prevents President Trump from unilaterally or impulsively starting one. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, a man who served on the battlefield in Iraq.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It takes a lot to get me to come down to these things, but I have been deeply troubled by some of the rhetoric I've been hearing about this. In fact, I was deeply troubled after yesterday when my colleagues, many of them left a classified briefing only to immediately and recklessly trash the quality of intelligence they received, and in some cases suggest there was no imminent threat from Soleimani. To suggest that would require you to ignore the death of Americans recently in Iraq, as well as ignore the history of Soleimani's campaign of terror across the Middle East. And we learned this weekend, while this body was still in recess, and before anyone had reviewed any of the classified information, that it was the intention of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to introduce this flawed War Powers resolution without having even seen any of the underlying intelligence. This suggests that this is not a serious effort.
Additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman may continue.
This is not a serious effort. This is a political effort that will have the practical effect only of undermining our military deterrent in the Middle East, which for the first time in a long time is actually stronger. And I think this does a service not only to our personnel in the region, but ultimately to the Iranian people. And what the Iranian regime fears more than anything else, more than the American military and the President of the United States, is its own people. And that is the reason Soleimani's death squads have gunned down Iranian civilians in the streets. And we look forward to the day when the Iranian people can be free of their evil, barbarous, reckless regime, and I applaud the administration's actions.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
May I inquire how much time I have?
It has 4 minutes remaining.
4 minutes. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, our founders vested in Congress the solemn responsibility of sending our sons and daughters to war. I have often heard folks say that now is not the time to discuss the use of force or decision to send our men and women to fight. I heard that in 2003 when I was carrying a rifle in Baghdad. I heard it again in 2004 and 2005 when I was leading my unit through the mountains of Afghanistan. And I am hearing it again today in the halls of Congress. In the last 19 years, more than 7,000 Americans have given their lives in these conflicts, 53,000 have been wounded, and we have spent over $4 trillion of taxpayer money. Do not believe the fear-mongering. This resolution does nothing to prevent the President from protecting the nation against imminent threats. I have spent years fighting to keep Americans safe and will continue to do so. I may have laid down my rifle, but my oath to this country endures. I will fight to ensure that we are having a discussion about when to send our men and women, our sons and daughters, and our sisters and brothers into harm's way. It is time to have this debate. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this point, I'm continue to reserve until the chairman is prepared to close.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
What I say, 30 seconds, 1 minute, I think. We'll start talking, I'll give you a hint.
Thank you, sir. I rise today to condemn the President's most recent reckless actions. The killing of General Soleimani was a provocation to war that made Americans less safe for years and maybe decades to come. The President has put his own ego over the strategic interest and safety of Americans. What he has accomplished with these actions is to make Soleimani a martyr for a generation of militant Middle Eastern foes that we have. It has united the Iranian people not against their government, but against us. It is the responsibility of the President.
Gentleman, additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman may continue.
It's the responsibility of the President and Congress to keep us safe. And the Founding Fathers knew that the collective wisdom of the people's representatives was better at doing that than one person. I just visited the SCIF, and there is still not any report on any imminent danger claim that might have been made. The American people and Congress deserve to know what the threat allegedly was, given the inevitability of Iranian retaliation. The two greatest powers Congress has is impeachment and declarations of war. We are here today on both of those issues because of a reckless, lawless, and impetuous president. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. Does the gentleman from Texas continue to reserve? Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to very distinguished gentleman from Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Meeks of New York.
And for how much time?
1 minute.
Okay. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
The President should not be able to commit the U.S. recklessly and flagrantly to war. That is the reason there are constitutional mandated checks and balances. The President escalated hostilities with Iran and did not demonstrate any imminent threat nor strategy as to why. He clearly did not make our country safer, quite the opposite. It is not a sign of strength, as some of my colleagues suggest. It was an unchecked sign of more disarray and lack of strategic thinking. We have seen what happens when we don't have a plan for what comes next, when we take out a bad actor without thinking through long-term consequences. We have lost too much blood and tears and treasure to ever allow that to happen again. I support and employ my colleagues to support this resolution for the sake and the state of future generations. I love this country. This is the greatest country in the world because we have checks and balances. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, I reserve my right to close.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I now recognize Mr. Berde for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized. Indiana is recognized.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, just got a couple of words I'd like to remind this body about. And I've heard a lot of talk about patriotism. And I gave this arm in Vietnam. And I've got a lot of good friends whose names are on the Vietnam Wall. So don't talk to me about patriotism and how much I love this country when we're standing here debating an issue that we all know is not going anywhere. And the last thing I would say to you is while I was serving in Vietnam, there were many occasions when I didn't have the ability to do what I thought was necessary. I'd just say to you that this body couldn't make up their mind whether they wanted to be in that war or not. And I suggest we get with the right program and do it now. Thank you.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Speaker, I'm prepared to close. And I yield myself the balance.
Gentleman is recognized.
Speaker, I'm strongly in favor of exercising our Article I authorities for matter as grave as war and peace. But the fact is, we are not at war with Iran, and the president is not trying to start a war with Iran. I met with the president earlier today. He told me that if this resolution passes, it will take all of his power to negotiate with Iran off the table. And that is the worst thing that we could do. Yesterday, he called for making a deal that allows for Iran to thrive and prosper. The president is making the choice to move towards de-escalation. The premise of this resolution is flawed because we are not engaged in hostilities with Iran. The president is not trying to start hostilities with Iran. And despite this public proclamation by our president, my colleagues are trying to claim that the president still wants to go to war. I deeply regret that my colleagues are not serious enough about exercising our Article I authorities to pursue regular order on such a serious question. We have had no hearings in the House Foreign Affairs Committee since these events transpired. There was no Foreign Affairs Committee markup of this legislation. I received text of this legislation only 2 hours before the Rules Committee meeting last night on a war powers resolution. Debating issues of war and peace is perhaps our most important responsibility as members of Congress, and yet this legislation dropped last night without committee consideration as required by the War Powers Resolution. If my colleagues were serious about Article I, as they say they are, this would be a joint resolution with the force of law. Instead, it is a House concurrent resolution that will never go to the president's desk. Let me translate what that means for the American people listening today. Today, we are voting on a press release, a press statement. This is a political statement for a left-wing domestic audience. But they are not the only ones watching, Mr. Speaker. Iran is watching, and its proxies are watching. And what they see is a divided America that does not fully support the ability of our commander-in-chief to respond to imminent threats to Americans. Churchill warned against appeasement when the dark clouds of fascism and the Third Reich swept in my father's war. Weakness invites aggression, he said. And as President Reagan said, peace through strength. I believe in these ideals and these axioms. And last May it was reported that Soleimani met with Iraqi militias in Baghdad and told them to, quote, prepare the proxies for war. Prepare for the proxy war. Without last week's strike, Soleimani would still be waging that proxy war, a war that he was escalating. An American was killed less than 2 weeks ago, and 4 American soldiers were injured. And our embassy in Baghdad was attacked under Soleimani's orders. What more do we need? What more evidence do we need? And let's talk about the fact he's a designated terrorist under the Obama administration. Importantly, the president told me today that Soleimani was planning to blow up our embassy. I need no further proof or evidence than that, or intelligence than that from the President of the United States. And what if the president had not acted? Let's assume that. What if the president, and by the way, some on the other side of the aisle were criticizing him for not responding after our embassy was attacked. What if he did not act? What if Soleimani made it back to Tehran to meet with the Ayatollah, to give the green light to carry out the plot to attack our soldiers and diplomats in Iraq? What if the Americans were killed? What if they killed our soldiers and diplomats? What if they successfully stormed our American embassy and held our Marines and diplomats hostage like they did in 1979 when this whole reign of terror started with Jimmy Carter in the White House? How would the critics of the president respond then if we had done nothing? How would America, the American people, respond? How would the Gold Star mothers respond? No, the president, this president, did the right thing to take out this threat that killed so many Americans. I've been to too many funerals, and many of us in this chamber have. And many of those soldiers were killed at the bloody hands of Soleimani. And so, those many Americans whose families still grieve today, we grieve for them. And since 1979, Iran has presided over a reign of terror in the region, and for over 2 decades, Soleimani has been the mastermind of terror, and the world is safer today without him. And let me just conclude by saying, now is not the time. Now is not the time to divide this nation and play into the propaganda of Iran. Now is the time not to tie our commander-in-chief's hands. Now is the time to support our men and women in uniform. And with that, I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this body has to make a decision about whether we're going to stand up for our constitutional responsibilities or just subordinate ourselves to the executive branch when it comes to war powers. We're 2 decades into the 21st century. Our country has been at war almost that entire time. Not a day goes by that I don't wish we could have some of those decisions back, especially because we see those measures we passed in 2001 and 2002 are still being used to justify sending American men and women into harm's way. We could stand here all day and say, well, your side let this happen when you were in charge, or you didn't say anything when this president did that. I don't disagree. It's been a collective failure on the part of this body that we've given away our authority on war powers, that we haven't done enough to grapple with the issue. Well, I hope today will not be the end of our efforts to make progress on debating Congress's war powers. If the president thinks he needs to use military force, he needs to come to Congress and make the case and let us vote on it. I urge my friends on both sides of the aisle, support this resolution. This is the beginning of Congress taking back its authority. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Rule 781, the previous question is ordered on the concurrent resolution as amended. The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The concurrent resolution is agreed to. And the yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the House Concurrent Resolution 83 will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5078. This is a 15-minute vote. Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. On this vote, the yeas are 224 and the nays are 194. The current resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5078 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 5078, a bill to amend the Small Business Act to provide reentry entrepreneurship, counseling, and training services for incarcerated individuals and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
On this vote, the yeas are 370, the nays are 41. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Gavel. The chair lays before the House the following enrolled bill.
H.R. 2467, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to provide funding to secure nonprofit facilities from terrorist attacks and for other purposes.
The House will be in order. Will members and staff please take their conversations off the floor? The House will be in order. Staff, please take your conversations off the floor. I love the way nobody listens. It's quieting down. So who's going to take over debate? The House will be in order. Members and staff, please take your conversations off the floor. Is that order enough? For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey?
Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous materials on H.R. 535.
Without objection. House Resolution 779 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 535. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 535, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to require the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency to designate per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances as hazardous substances under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and amendments specified in House Resolution 779 and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus. Each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
It will be in order. Members will take their conversations off the floor. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, I should say. H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act of 2019, is a comprehensive package of strategies to regulate PFAS chemicals, clean up contamination, and protect public health. PFAS are an urgent threat to public health. They're toxic, persistent, and being found in the environment across the country. These forever chemicals have long been linked with adverse health effects, including cancer, immune system effects, infertility, impaired child development, high cholesterol, and thyroid disease. Mr. Chairman, the EPA has known about these risks for decades and has allowed this contamination to spread. Last year, EPA announced its PFAS action plan. It was woefully inadequate, and since that time, we've learned that EPA is not even keeping the weak commitments it made in that plan. The EPA failed to meet key end-of-the-year 2019 deadlines. It failed to produce a regulatory determination in drinking water, and it failed to produce hazard determinations for chemicals under Superfund, and it failed to initiate reporting under the Toxic Release Inventory. The Trump administration is failing hundreds of impacted communities, and Congress must act for communities like Hoosick Falls, New York, Parchment, Michigan, Parkersburg, West Virginia, and far too many more. We need to act on behalf of states like my own, New Jersey, that are doing everything they can, adopting protective state drinking water standards, pursuing natural resource damage cases, but facing strong opposition from federal agencies under the Trump administration. There have been over 500 detections of PFAS in drinking water and groundwater sources in New Jersey, and this is simply...
Gentlemen will suspend. House will be in order. Members are advised to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman's recognized.
And this is simply unacceptable, Mr. Chairman. It's time for Congress to take action and use every tool available to stop the flow of PFAS pollution into our environment and our bodies. And that's exactly what the PFAS Action Act does. This bill requires EPA to immediately designate 2 PFAS chemicals as hazardous substances under Superfund, the 2 most studied of the PFAS chemicals. And EPA is committed to make this designation in their action plan last year, but has failed to fulfill that promise. The legislation requires that over a 5-year period, EPA review all other PFAS chemicals and decide whether to list them under Superfund. During that 5 years, the bill will require comprehensive health testing of all PFAS chemicals. This is a really important point. You may hear my colleagues talk today about the need to base decisions on science, and this bill will generate that science. The 2 chemicals will be regulated up front because we already have the science on them, and other PFAS will be regulated if over the next 5 years the science concludes that they're hazardous. The bill also includes a moratorium on any new PFAS during that same 5-year period, and this will provide EPA the time it needs to ensure it has enough science to really evaluate new PFAS. H.R. 535 also requires a drinking water standard that will cover at least the 2 chemicals and others at EPA's discretion. Importantly, the drinking water standard will have to protect public health, including the health of vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women, infants, and children. And because treating drinking water to remove PFAS is expensive, the bill includes grants for water utilities. Now, Mr. Chairman, this bill includes a voluntary PFAS-free label for cookware, which may be expanded through amendments to include additional categories of consumer products. This label will empower consumers to take steps to protect themselves from exposure to PFAS. And the bill requires guidance for first responders to help them minimize their exposure to PFAS chemicals. This is important because PFAS is commonly found in firefighting foams. Taken together, this is a serious, comprehensive, and reasonable bill that should garner strong bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I want to particularly thank Chairman Tonko for all that he did to put together this package. And of course, the sponsor of the package is Ms. Dingell from Michigan, who's faced so many problems in your home state, Mr. Chairman, where Ms. Dingell is also so much involved. And the bill includes a number of pieces of legislation before our committee by members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as other members of this body. So with that, I reserve the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Many members on both sides of the aisle have worked hard to understand and address issues related to per and polyfluorinated compounds. And while I oppose H.R. 535 for both policy and practical reasons, I commend all my colleagues who have been engaged on this issue. Before I go into some of the more concerning aspects of this legislation, I think it's instructive to highlight a few facts. PFAS is not just one or two chemicals. According to the EPA, this class of chemicals includes more than 5,000 different substances with different properties, applications, and risk. In fact, EPA's master list of PFAS on its website includes 7,866 derivations. EPA does not have health effect data on the vast majority of PFAS. In fact, EPA recently announced scientifically valid methods. That means you're able to test to determine what it is, of just 29 of these 7,866. We don't have the capability to even understand if it's present because we don't have the capability to even identify them. EPA is actively engaged in a PFAS action program involving many disciplines across the agency. I recently talked to the administrator to urge him to move as quickly as possible with multiple action items and timelines. Now enter this bill, H.R. 535. This legislation requires aggressive regulatory responses to this diverse class of man-made chemicals without regard to science or risk. This is an unprecedented way of conducting science and flies in the face of decades of U.S. environmental policy. In fact, we have never legislatively banned a chemical in all the years since the Superfund back in 1980. To my colleagues who love to preach science on climate change, I hear you, but you cannot walk away from the science debate when it doesn't support your policy positions. Let me say that again. For my Democrat friends who love to preach science, you can't walk away from the science debate on this substance and walk away from the fact that we need a scientific study of this. But they're trying to have it both ways. I know many of my Democrat colleagues think this bill is essential because they don't trust the EPA run by this president. I understand that's your call. But I would also ask you to think about the mandates you're placing on the Environmental Protection Agency, which will far outlast this administration. They will legally hamstring future ones from facing issues other than PFAS, whether it's lead or climate. I mentioned the science-based decisions that have supported EPA's work for years are being jettisoned, but that is just one feature. The more long-range trouble includes the automatic designation of PFOS, PFOS, and PFOA, PFOA, as hazardous substances under the Superfund, which is called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensatory Liability Act, CERCLA. This designation may be warranted under the bill. It would become without knowledge of who is responsible, where PFAS contamination is, and how serious it is without any public comment. In fact, my colleagues think putting it in the Superfund is going to solve this problem. They're going to be able to clean it up right away. Well, I have a list here of Superfund sites. Superfund fund was set up in 1980. We have a site here that's still a Superfund site back to 1983. So those of you who think, put it in the Superfund, it's going to be all cleaned up, good luck. If you've dealt with this issue, it's not going to happen probably in your lifetime. And don't get me started on the perverse, strict, joint, and several and retroactive liability to releases of hazardous substances. a trial lawyer's bonanza. We know the majority understands this is an issue because the rule executed provisions relieving airports of Superfund liability. Plus, the bill requires EPA to review all 7,864 PFAS in 5 years to determine, without public comment, whether they present a substantial damage. We can't do 29 in 20 years. How are we going to do 7,866 chemicals in 5 years? Just can't be done. While a Superfund designation for just PFOS and PFOA may seem reasonable, the reality is that Section 15 of H.R. 535 deems all PFAS and hazardous air pollutants under the Clean Air Act Section 112B. This automatically makes the entire PFAS class hazardous substances under the Superfund law. As I mentioned, innocent parties like drinking water utilities that just treated what they got from their source water are hostage to endless liability for cleanup regardless of their personal contribution. In fact, I would argue they didn't do any contribution. Why not exclude the water districts from Superfund liability if they are just the pass-through? But no, we're taking care of the airports, but we're not protecting municipal water systems, co-op water systems, and other sources of drinking water, and we're going to put additional mandates and cost on them. I know communities with PFAS pollution want it cleaned up quickly, but nothing, as I said before, will circle as fast. It's always more expensive than you think, and the stigma of the designation scars a community's economy and dampens its future prospect. Other significant problems with this legislation include Section 4, which places a commercial moratorium on new PFAS chemicals for 5 years, even though federal law already prevents any unsafe chemical from entering the market until EPA scientifically reviews it and determines its safety. This delays cleaner, greener, and safer chemicals from the market. Let me repeat this. Existing law bans and bars any new chemical or new use of an existing chemical from going to the market unless EPA signs off on that and it meets a tough safety standard. This bill places an arbitrary ban on top of that review. Next generation heart valves, car brakes, solar panels, military equipment, all will be stopped from coming to market because of this. Section 3 creates an unrealistic mandate on EPA to require all manufacturers and processor testing of PFAS. This requirement overlaps one that companies send all their existing PFAS information to the EPA by 2023. Regardless, why even bother doing real science when you've already made a decision based on political science? More practically, does EPA even have the resources to keep up with such a demand? We could have asked them had they been invited to testify on this legislation. These are not minor concerns. They sparked opposition, especially in the Senate, and are the reason why these items were not included in the National Defense Authorization Act. If this process is making good law instead of messaging, I would urge my colleagues to keep that in mind when voting. We can do better, and I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Mr. Shimkus, who has really poured his heart and soul into this issue and has worked very hard on it, is so knowledgeable about it, and he's spot on. Tragically, there's no science here. The EPA was not allowed to testify here. This is a solution that will never become law, it completely overreaches. You're going to hear from some of our members, including Dr. Bouchon, who's a heart surgeon, about the impact this could have on new technologies and devices that get implanted in people's hearts. You will hear about automobiles and aircraft that use these very specialized chemicals and materials in their manufacturing processes that probably have nothing to do with what we're trying to fix here. You will hear, and it is true, that this is the first time we're going to throw science out the window and make a political decision. So I must rise in opposition to H.R. 535, the PFAS Action Act of 2020, and urge my colleagues, sadly, to do the same. We all want a solution to the country's PFAS challenges, and while there is more work to be done, I would say, thanks to Mr. Shimkus and others, Congress has already acted to provide some funding for reducing PFAS in drinking water
in rural and economically distressed areas. We require the federal government to enter into cooperative cleanup agreements for federal facilities with PFAS contamination. But we all know more needs to be done. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side of the aisle have chosen to go partisan with H.R. 535, and that's not the way to go. It's not the solution. This follows two plays Democrats insist on running ad nauseum, putting politics over progress and pushing legislation that will never become law. This was the playbook they ran in December, when sadly they walked away from progress in protecting public health. That resulted in two major missed opportunities. First, we had the chance to mandate that the EPA establish a drinking water standard for PFOA and PFOS within 2 years. We had that opportunity to get into law. Second, we could have ensured immediate and mandatory cleanup of PFOA and PFOS at all Department of Defense facilities. We could have put that in law. We were in agreement, except for Democrats here, and as a result, they wouldn't take yes for an answer, and we lost those opportunities. But back to H.R. 535. This measure is packed with bad policy and unfortunately, or fortunately, is dead on arrival in the Senate. Sadly, it delays much-needed action to enact science-based solutions and protect our constituents. So this hurts Americans. It leaves our communities vulnerable, and it did not have to be this way. During the Energy and Commerce Committee's consideration of H.R. 535, we had a very robust debate on this bill. Mr. Shimkus offered a package of proposals that had bipartisan Senate support, and those all could have become law. In other words, a three-corners agreement of committees of jurisdiction. These proposals were not the way he or I would have crafted them on our own, but we were willing to compromise. We were willing to reach across the aisle. We were willing to reach across the chamber to the Senate because we want to be part of the solution. Sadly, we're here today with a bill that frankly reaches a new low. Last month, we had a vehicle to make real meaningful progress on drinking water standards and PFAS cleanup. We could have done more, but that progress was stopped, and this bill was brought forward. So, Mr. Chair, I want to help communities deal with PFAS concerns. I want to do it in a scientifically based way. It's important the actions we take are appropriately measured and justified and backed up by science. This package, though, is not a practical science-based solution, and I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield now 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, our majority leader, and I want to thank him for prioritizing this PFAS packaging and making it one of the first things that we do in 2020. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his
Gentleman's
comments,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. Nobody has fought harder than Mr. Pallone and Mr. Tonko to make sure that this legislation moves forward. And of course, we worked very hard with the Senate to try to have these protections included in the Senate bill. Unfortunately, we didn't get there. But Mr. Speaker, while I'm glad that Congress was able to take small steps to address the hazards of PFAS contamination through passage of the 2020 Defense Authorization Bill last month, that action alone was not enough. That's why the House is taking further action this week. These contaminants, known as forever chemicals, because they do not break down and can remain in the human body for many years, have been shown to raise one's risk of deadly cancers, reproductive and immune system disorders, and other health problems. For decades, we've known that PFAS contamination is a problem. According to the EPA, millions of Americans are exposed to unsafe levels of PFAS through their drinking water. The Trump administration, under its own PFAS action plan, promised to establish a drinking water standard by the end of last year. Let me repeat that. The administration planned to have a standard by the end of last year. Unfortunately, that has not been accomplished. It has taken neither of the steps that it indicated it would, making this legislation very necessary. That's why the House is considering PFAS legislation this week, introduced by Congresswoman Dingell and Congressman Upton, a bipartisan piece of legislation. I want to congratulate Ms. Dingell for her continuing leadership on this issue. I want to thank also others who have worked on this legislation, including the gentleman from from New Hampshire, Chris Pappas. The package of 12 bills was approved by the Energy and Commerce Committee on a bipartisan vote in November. Its provisions will, among others, establish a protective, safe drinking water standard for PFAS contamination based upon science. Based upon science. Improve testing of existing PFAS chemicals, limit the introduction of new ones, and provide for their safe disposal. Most importantly, it will begin the process of helping clean up PFAS-contaminated sites under the Superfund program. Critically important, particularly the sponsors are fighting contaminated sites in their own areas. The Defense Department, which for years has used firefighting foaming containing PFAS chemicals, has failed to clean up its sites across the country that have contaminated the drinking water of countless Americans. Why is that? Because the EPA has failed to list these chemicals under the Superfund law, notwithstanding their toxic and adverse effects. This legislation is a major action aimed at safeguarding public health and protecting Americans' access to clean and safe drinking water. I want to thank Representative Dingell for her leadership on this issue, her partner, Fred Upton, the former chairman of the committee, Chairman Pallone, and Subcommittee Chairman Tonko of the Energy and Commerce Committee, who've both done extraordinary work on this legislation. I also want to thank Chairman DeFazio of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for his committee's efforts to address this issue as well. I commend the 50 members of the bipartisan House PFAS Task Force, 50 members, bipartisan, who have been working diligently on this issue for years. I also commend Representative Chris Pappas